Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive on some horror movies you might have missed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, back in the 2000s.
Okay.
And we're using a list from Screen Rant called The 10 Most Overlooked Horror Movies of the 2000s as our guide.
Okay, cool.
So, yeah, we'll see if you've seen any of these or not.
Yeah. The 2000s, I mean, that was such a great time for horror. Um, I think we're bound to find some hidden gems.
Yeah, so Screen Rant kicks things off by talking about how the 2000s had everything from the super gory slashers like Hostel
Right.
to psychological thrillers like The Others. And what's interesting is they highlight atmosphere as being like a key ingredient.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Atmosphere is huge in horror. It can really make or break a film.
Right.
I think if you think about The Others, for example, it relies on this really chilling gothic mood to get under your skin.
Yes.
You know, like the darkened house, the constant fog, the children's sensitivity to light. It's also effective.
Right, and it stars Nicole Kidman, who had already done Dead Calm back in the 80s.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you think her experience with Dead Calm added to her performance in The Others?
Oh, I absolutely do.
Yeah.
You know, both films deal with isolation, paranoia, but The Others adds this layer of supernatural dread.
Yeah.
And Kidman's performance is fantastic. It's all about this kind of restrained terror.
Yeah.
So I definitely think her earlier role in Dead Calm helped her convey that.
That's funny. You mentioned Dead Calm being from the 80s, and I just realized that The Others came out in 2001, the same year as another movie on the list, The Devil's Backbone.
Oh, The Devil's Backbone, such a good film. And directed by the amazing Guillermo del Toro.
Yeah.
Now, while it shares that gothic atmosphere with The Others, the setting of a Spanish Civil War orphanage adds a whole other layer of tension.
Yeah.
Del Toro is just a master at blending historical trauma with supernatural horror. It creates this like pervasive sense of dread.
Yeah. Okay, so Screen Rant points to The Hole, starring a young Keira Knightley, as a British take on teen horror.
Yeah.
What stood out to you about this one?
It's really interesting. They take this very simple premise of, teenagers trapped in an underground bunker.
Right.
And they use that to explore these like primal fears of isolation and hunger.
Oh, yeah.
And the setting, the limited setting, just heightens the tension so much.
Yeah.
And you see how those fears can really warp relationships.
Oh, for sure.
It
Yeah.
exposes this like darker side of human nature.
It's like even without supernatural elements, the characters become the horror.
Totally.
And speaking of intense situations, Screen Rant brings up Quarantine,
Okay.
the 2008 found footage film with Jennifer Carpenter.
Oh, yeah.
So it's basically about being stuck in an apartment building during a terrifying viral outbreak.
Yes. So Quarantine is a remake of the Spanish film REC, which came out the year before. What's so interesting about both films is how they use that found footage style to create this claustrophobic and panicked feeling.
Oh, yeah.
You really feel like you're right there with the characters experiencing everything in real time.
With found footage, it's like we're right in the thick of it, seeing it through the character's eyes. This was around the time that Cloverfield and Lake Mungo were gaining popularity.
Right.
Do you see Quarantine as part of that trend, or does it do something different?
I think it's definitely part of that trend. But I think Quarantine really stands out because of just how relentless the intensity is.
Right.
It really cranks up that fear and chaos, making it almost like a visceral, overwhelming experience.
Yeah.
And of course, Jennifer Carpenter, she just brings that incredible intensity she also showed in The Exorcism of Emily Rose.
Yeah. Okay, next up is 13 Ghosts, a remake of the 1960s film. It's about a family that inherits a house, but it turns out to be, well, not your typical fixer-upper.
Yeah, what sets 13 Ghosts apart is its really unique premise. You have this family trapped in a house with these murderous ghosts that they can only see with special glasses.
Oh, wow.
It's this clever way to blend those classic haunted house tropes with like a more modern visual style.
The special effects were pretty wild for the time.
They definitely have that early 2000s CGI feel. But, I think they still work.
Okay.
The ghost designs are creepy. And the way that they're integrated into those practical sets is really effective. But beyond the visuals, I think what makes 13 Ghosts interesting is this way it blends horror with family drama. The characters aren't just fighting for their lives, they're fighting to protect each other.
That's a good point.
Which adds this like a really nice emotional layer.
Let's switch gears and talk about a film that's known for pushing the boundaries of horror. High Tension, a French film from 2003. Definitely not for the faint of heart.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
High Tension is part of this wave of French horror films that came out in the early 2000s, sometimes called French extremity. These films are known for their brutal realism, the unflinching violence, a willingness to shock the audience.
Yeah.
High tension really embodies all of that.
Yeah.
It's a home invasion thriller that quickly spirals into a complete nightmare.
I'm curious, how effective is that extreme style in horror? Does it amplify the fear, or can it become too much? Because you also have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake from that same year, which was pretty brutal, and another French film, Dead End, also from 2003.
Yeah. It's a delicate balance,
Yeah.
for sure. High tension uses violence to create this, feeling of relentless danger and dread.
Yeah.
It keeps you on edge, never letting you feel safe.
Yeah.
But it's not just about shock value.
Right.
The film also explores these themes of obsession and repressed desires, which add a psychological depth to the violence.
Okay, so Screen Rant then takes us to Asia with Three Extremes.
Okay.
An anthology film with segments directed by filmmakers from different East Asian countries.
Right.
The first story caught my eye. It explores this woman's obsession with youth and beauty, and then it takes this really dark turn.
Asian horror often relies on a much slower burn, using atmosphere, symbolism, and psychological dread to create a really unsettling experience. And the first segment of Three Extremes is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
It taps into these societal pressures and anxieties, specifically around aging and beauty standards,
Right.
and twists them into something truly disturbing.
Yeah. That focus on, like, psychological dread, the things that get under your skin rather than just going for the jump scares,
Yeah.
feels like a hallmark of Asian horror. How does Three Extremes compare to other popular Asian horror films from around that time, like The Grudge or Shudder?
Definitely shares that emphasis on atmosphere and psychological horror with those films, but I think it goes a step further in terms of the themes it explores and the disturbing imagery it employs. It's a film that really stays with you long after you've seen it.
Yeah.
Makes you think about the darker impulses that drive human behavior.
It's interesting you mentioned those darker impulses because the next film on the list is Dreamcatcher, based on the Stephen King novel.
Oh, yeah.
It's about a group of friends who encounter an alien force during a hunting trip. And it has that classic King blend of friendship, survival, and just a touch of cosmic horror.
Yeah. Dreamcatcher is a really interesting blend of sci-fi horror and body horror. The way King describes those alien parasites is so vivid and so unsettling.
Yeah.
And the film captures that grotesque element perfectly.
It has Morgan Freeman, Damian Lewis, and Thomas Jane.
Oh, wow.
It's a pretty impressive cast for a movie that flew under the radar. Do you think that star power added anything to the film?
Absolutely. Each of those actors brings a certain gravitas to their role, which really helps to ground the more fantastical elements of the story.
Right.
And if you're a fan of the Alien franchise, you'll find a lot of similarities in how that alien threat is portrayed in Dreamcatcher.
That makes sense. And Screen Rant highlights The Collector as an overlooked gem.
Oh, yeah. The Collector.
This one seems like tailor-made for those who love suspense and intricate traps.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The Collector came out in 2009, same year as Saw 6, and both share this fascination with elaborate and often gruesome traps. But where The Collector stands out is its protagonist, Arkin, played by Josh Stewart.
Right.
He's not just a victim. He's resourceful, and he fights back,
Oh, okay.
turning it into this cat-and-mouse game.
So it's less about helpless victims and more about watching someone try to outsmart the killer.
Totally.
That's cool.
It adds a whole other level of, tension and excitement.
Right.
You're rooting for Arkin to survive, to outmaneuver the killer. And while the film doesn't shy away from violence, it's not gratuitous. It serves the story and heightens that suspense.
Okay. Finally, we come to I Know Who Killed Me, starring Lindsay Lohan. This one really dives into the mysteries of identity and trauma, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
I Know Who Killed Me is a psychological thriller with elements of body horror. The protagonist escapes a serial killer, but believes she is someone else entirely, insisting that the real victim is still in danger.
Yeah.
It's this really interesting exploration of a fragmented identity, where the protagonist's body and mind seem at war with each other.
It's like we've got this mystery of who she really is, plus the fear that the killer might still be out there.
Exactly.
That sounds like a recipe for some serious psychological tension.
The film uses visual style to great effect to reflect that protagonist's, kind of unstable mental state.
Yeah.
You have these dreamlike sequences, distorted images, and a color palette that shifts to mirror her emotional turmoil.
I Know Who Killed Me came out in 2007, same year as 30 Days of Night and 1408.
Oh, yeah.
Both excellent horror films.
Yeah.
But what makes I Know Who Killed Me stand out?
It stands out because it's a female-driven narrative. It's exploring these psychological themes of identity and trauma. And it takes these familiar horror tropes, the serial killer, the final girl, and it twists them into something really unexpected and psychologically complex.
Okay, so we've just scratched the surface of these 10 overlooked horror films from the 2000s.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack.
I'm already adding a few of these to my watch list.
You too?
It's a good reminder that there are so many great horror films out there waiting to be rediscovered. Films that might not have gotten the attention they deserved initially, but offer something really unique and compelling.
Right.
That's what I love about deep dives like this. You never know what gems you'll unearth. But we'll have to pause here and pick up our exploration of these overlooked horror films in the next part of this deep dive.
Sounds good. It's crazy how many good horror films just slip through the cracks, you know?
I know, it's true.
It's like they just need a little bit more attention and then
Yeah.
they can find an audience.
Okay, so where did we leave off? Oh yeah, I Know Who Killed Me.
I Know Who Killed Me, yes.
With Lindsay Lohan. This one really seems to divide people. Some people find it confusing. Others call it a cult classic.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
You know, I think it all comes down to the film's unconventional narrative
Yeah.
and the way it plays with identity. It's not a straightforward horror film. It's more of a psychological puzzle.
Yeah.
And that could be off-putting for some viewers. But for those who appreciate that kind of ambiguity and that kind of mind-bending storytelling,
Right.
I Know Who Killed Me can be a really rewarding experience.
It's fascinating how a film's style can influence how it's received.
For sure.
Speaking of style, let's jump back to 13 Ghosts for a second.
Okay.
I'm curious about the visual approach to the ghosts themselves.
Yeah.
It's a remake of a 1960s film, but it came out in 2001, a time when CGI was becoming more prominent in horror. How did the filmmakers balance those practical effects with the CGI?
It's a great question. It's a blend of both, and I think they did a really good job of integrating those two. The ghost designs are very much influenced by the original film's aesthetic, which relied on this like more theatrical, almost operatic visual.
Yeah.
But they updated those designs using CGI to give the ghosts this, more ethereal and unsettling presence. And they used practical effects for some of the more visceral elements, like the ghost's interactions with the physical environment.
You mentioned the original 13 Ghosts. Could you give us a little background on that one for our listeners who might not be familiar? And how does the 2001 remake compare?
Yeah. So the 1960s 13 Ghosts was directed by William Castle, who was known for his very gimmicky horror films. He actually used this process called illusiono for the film,
Wow.
which involved giving audience members these special glasses so they could view the ghosts on screen.
Oh, wow.
The 2001 remake kept that concept of the special glasses,
Right.
but updated it with more modern technology and, of course, more elaborate special effects.
Okay, now for something completely different, let's talk about Dreamcatcher for a minute. You mentioned its connection to the Alien franchise.
Right.
And I can definitely see the similarities in how that alien threat is portrayed.
Yeah.
But Dreamcatcher is also based on a Stephen King novel. And I'm wondering, how does the film capture that distinct, Stephen King blend of horror and humanity?
Dreamcatcher, like a lot of King's stories, it's about more than just the monster.
Right.
It's about these bonds of friendship, the complexities of memory and trauma, the ways that ordinary people react to these really extraordinary events. The film really captures that sense of small-town camaraderie that King writes about so well.
Yeah.
And it really allows the characters to be flawed and vulnerable and even heroic at times.
Dreamcatcher got me thinking about how horror often blends with other genres, like
Yeah.
we saw with the sci-fi elements in that film.
Right.
High Tension, for instance, leans heavily into slasher,
Yeah.
whereas The Hole feels more like a survival thriller.
Right.
Do you think these genre blends add something special to horror, or do they muddy the waters?
I think genre blending can be really effective in horror, as long as it's done thoughtfully.
Yeah.
When it works well, it allows filmmakers to explore all these different facets of fear and suspense. High Tension, for example, it uses that slasher framework to create this relentless sense of dread, but it also adds this layer of psychological complexity that elevates it beyond your typical slasher film.
Right.
And then The Whole, by combining elements of horror and survival thriller, It explores not only the characters' fear of the unknown, but also the ways they turn on each other when faced with these, like, extreme circumstances.
Yeah, it's like it adds these extra layers to the fear,
Well,
making it more complex and engaging. Now let's shift gears again and talk about Quarantine.
okay.
We discussed how it uses the found footage style to create that sense of immediacy and chaos.
Right.
But what I find really effective is how it slowly reveals the nature of the threat.
Yeah.
You're never quite sure what you're dealing with.
Yeah. That slow burn approach to revealing the threat is one of the film's greatest strengths.
Yeah.
It keeps you guessing,
Right?
and it allows the tension to build so gradually.
You mentioned that Quarantine is a remake of the Spanish film REC.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated by how remakes approach the source material.
Yeah.
Do you think Quarantine does something different with the story, or is it pretty faithful?
Quarantine is a very faithful remake, sticking closely to the plot and structure of REC.
Okay.
However, it does make a few changes,
Okay.
primarily in terms of, like, the characters and the setting.
Right.
The apartment building in Quarantine feels much more American,
Okay.
and the characters are slightly different. Jennifer Carpenter's reporter character plays a much more central role.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
It's like they took the core elements of REC and adapted them
Right.
to fit that American context.
Yeah.
I want to circle back to the concept of French extremity that we discussed earlier
Right.
in relation to high tension. It's a term that's often used to describe like certain wave of French horror,
Yes.
but it can be a bit controversial. Why do you think that is?
I think French extremity films are often controversial because of their graphic violence
Yeah.
and their unflinching portrayal of human suffering.
Yeah.
They push boundaries,
Right.
and they don't shy away from shocking the audience.
Right.
So some viewers see this as, gratuitous or exploitative,
Right.
while others really appreciate the film's rawness and their willingness to explore those, like, dark corners of human nature.
It's like a matter of taste and
Right.
how much you're willing to be challenged or disturbed.
For sure.
Now let's talk about a film that takes a very different approach to horror, The Others.
Oh, The Others, yes.
You described it as a masterclass in atmosphere.
It is.
And I completely agree. It's a
Yeah.
film that relies on suggestion and psychological dread rather than just outright scares.
Totally.
Yeah.
The Others is all about creating a mood, a sense of unease that permeates every single scene.
Yeah. And the film's slow burn approach
Oh, yeah.
just allows that tension to build gradually, keeping you on the edge of your seat.
Absolutely.
It's interesting how The Others uses those classic haunted house tropes.
Mhm.
The creaking doors, the whispering voices, the fleeting glimpses of shadows.
Yeah.
But it elevates them with this like elegant and unsettling style.
It's a film that gets under your skin and stays with you. And I think a lot of that has to do with Nicole Kidman's performance.
Oh, yeah.
She just conveys this sense of fragile strength.
Yeah.
A mother desperately trying to protect her children
Right.
while also battling her own fears and uncertainties.
It's such a nuanced performance. You can see the fear in her eyes, but also the determination, the love for her children. Okay, so we've covered The Others and its masterful use of atmosphere. Now, I'm curious about your thoughts on The Devil's Backbone. It's another film that creates a palpable sense of dread, but in such a different setting.
Yeah. The Devil's Backbone takes place in this dilapidated orphanage during the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah.
A setting that's already imbued with this, like, sense of loss and trauma. And Guillermo del Toro really uses that historical backdrop to create an atmosphere of unease and tension.
Right.
The orphanage itself feels haunted by the ghosts of the past,
Right.
both literally and figuratively.
It's interesting how Del Toro blends the horrors of war with the supernatural, creating this sense that the characters are being haunted by both.
Yeah, the film explores these themes of childhood innocence lost, the legacy of violence, and the ways that trauma can manifest in these, like, really unexpected ways.
Yeah.
It's a haunting and poetic film
Yeah.
that really stays with you.
We've talked about how The Devil's Backbone and The Others both rely on atmosphere and psychological dread to create those scares. What are some of the challenges of creating effective horror without relying on the jump scares or the gore?
It's definitely more challenging to sustain tension and fear without those visceral elements.
Yeah.
But when it's done well, psychological horror can be so incredibly effective.
Right.
It's about tapping into those primal fears, those things that unsettle us on this, like, deeper level. It's about suggestion. It's about atmosphere. And leaving space for the audience's imagination to fill in the blanks.
I think that's one of the reasons why films like The Others and The Devil's Backbone have such staying power. They really linger in your mind,
Yeah,
haunting you with their imagery and their unsettling themes.
totally. Sometimes the most effective horror is the kind that doesn't show you everything, the kind that lets your imagination do the work.
Yeah. If you had to pick one film from our list to recommend to someone who's looking for a truly unforgettable horror experience, which one would it be?
Well, that's a tough one.
I know.
So many good choices. Um, if I had to pick just one, I'd probably go with the others. It's masterfully crafted. It combines those classic haunted house tropes with this chilling atmosphere, and Nicole Kidman gives a truly haunting performance.
Okay, The Others, it is. I'm putting that on my watch list.
Good choice.
For those looking for something a little more intense,
Okay.
maybe with a touch of French extremity, what would you suggest?
High Tension is a wild ride. I have to
Yeah.
say, it's not for the faint of heart,
Right.
but if you're looking for something that will push boundaries and keep you on the edge of your seat, High Tension is worth checking out.
Okay, and let's not forget the Stephen King fans out there. We talked about Dreamcatcher, which has its share of sci-fi horror and body horror. Do you think it's a good entry point for someone who wants to explore King on screen, or are there others you'd recommend?
I think Dreamcatcher is a fun and freaky film,
Right.
but it's not necessarily the most representative of King's work.
Okay.
If you're looking for a more classic King adaptation, I'd recommend The Shining or Misery.
Mhm.
Both films really capture King's ability to blend horror with psychological depth and create these characters that feel so real, so relatable,
Right.
even when they're facing these, like, really terrifying circumstances.
As we wrap up our deep dive into these overlooked horror films from the 2000s, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. Why do you think these particular films flew under the radar? Were they just overshadowed by bigger releases, or did they maybe challenge audiences in ways they weren't ready for?
I think it's probably a combination of factors.
Right.
Some of these films were released at a time when horror was undergoing a shift, moving away from the slasher-heavy trends of the 90s and exploring this, like, new territory.
Yeah.
And some of them, like High Tension and Three Extremes, might have been too intense or
Right.
too unconventional
Yeah.
for mainstream audiences.
It's like they were ahead of their time,
Yeah,
pushing boundaries, experimenting with new approaches to horror.
totally. And that's what makes them so fascinating to revisit now. You know, they offer a glimpse into a time when horror was evolving, trying new things, and finding its voice in a new millennium.
And they remind us that there are always hidden gems out there,
Always.
waiting to be discovered.
Right.
So if you're feeling adventurous and you're in the mood for a good scare, I encourage you to seek out some of these overlooked horror films from the 2000s.
Yes.
You just might be surprised by what you find.
And who knows, maybe one of these films will become your new favorite.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into overlooked 2000s horror. Thanks for joining us on this creepy journey. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a different topic, so stay tuned.